as of the day that we are streaming currently, it's International Men's Day. And what better time than International Men's Day to talk about the one instance in which misandry is a real thing. Misandry is real. A specific type of misandry, the most valid type of misandry, is what we are going to call transandrophobia. I'm trans, and we're going to be specifically talking about the experience being assigned female and feeling that you are trans and you're transitioning towards something more masculine, and what is that like in terms of like the world is pretty bigoted towards differences. And we can see, yeah, like we have clear things like, yeah, misogyny. Smacking a woman's ass without her permission, that's a form of misogyny. Like it's anti-woman possessive behavior, right? And we can identify that there's like transphobia. You know, transphobia is generally like hating on someone because they're trans, refusing to use their name or pronouns, whatever, blah, blah, blah. There's different flavors of bigotry. So before we go too much further, I just want to say, hit the like button if you're enjoying the content. Consider subscribing and hitting the bell and maybe clicking all notifications to get notifications for the channel. Also consider checking out my brand new merch store, which just launched. There's going to be a link down in the description. And you can also check out my Patreon, where there are some promo deals for patrons if you want to maybe get a deal on some of your merchandise. So thank you very much for watching the content. Hope you continue to enjoy. So transandrophobia is the specific kind of hatred that there is in the world towards trans men. And we're talking about it because it's a subject that I don't think a lot of people know about. Not a lot of people really think about it. You might think like, why do we need a specific term? Why can't we just call this transphobia? And I will say, like, there's like a distinction between broader kinds of bigotry versus like targeted kinds of bigotry. You know, we could say that someone is homophobic. That could mean like they're against gay men specifically, or it could mean they're against like all gay people. The concept of like corrective sexual assault on lesbians is uniquely a lesbophobic practice that you could say that's homophobic because it is against gay women, right? But more specifically, it is lesbophobic, bigoted toward lesbians because of the idea that like, oh, well, you just haven't had a good dick yet. You know, you just need to be converted. So it's a sort of similar thing here where there is transphobia, generally speaking, like hating on trans people, refusing to use like their pronouns, calling them delusional, whatever. It's not specifically targeted toward trans men or women or non-binary people. All trans people get the same treatment in that form of bigotry, right? But you can also say, like, it's pretty common. You'll hear the term transmisogyny. You hear the term misogyny. Transmisogyny is hatred towards trans women. And a lot of people like to be hating on trans women. So it's pretty popular and it's pretty common to do, which is probably why people talk about it more. So we end up like discussing the specific issues that trans women have of being told they're never going to be real women because they can't give birth. You are a predator, like who's trying to get in women's spaces. Like that's a very specific kind of hatred that gets targeted towards trans women because they were assigned male. There's an assumption that male equals predator, or that a male trying to look like a woman is trying to do it so that she can prey on you for some reason, whatever. That's specifically transmisogyny, okay? Now looking at transandrophobia, andro meaning man or masculine. Transandrophobia is just like the same type of word as transmisogyny, but refers to trans men. I think a lot of folks have like this impression that trans men don't have serious issues, that like they don't have specific problems as trans men, like a specific kind of bigotry against them. And I think that that is something that is a major oversight because a lot of trans men do have this very specific experience, right? So plenty of trans men have experienced misogyny directed toward them. Maybe before they ever came out, you know, maybe when they were a teenager, people thought they looked like a girl, so they got hit on and like catcalled at an inappropriate age, right? Being subject to misogyny, like being talked down to, not being considered for scholarships or jobs or whatever, that's misogyny, and trans men can experience that for sure. You also have like this additional thing that happens when you come out, this thing that starts happening. If, you know, speaking back to the corrective sexual assault, example earlier, if a trans man is sexually assaulted in an attempt to normalize him, like Brandon Teena. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the movie Boys Don't Cry, which stars a cis woman, but it's about a trans man who was, obviously, like, trigger warning here, was raped and then murdered for being a trans man. Like, it was an attempted corrective rape. Like, oh, you know, no one's taught you how to be a good girl yet, kind of thing, you know? And, like, that is in the same way as, like, the corrective rape towards lesbians is specifically lesbophobic. Like, sexually assaulting a trans man with the intent of, like, trying to correct him or teach him to be a girl, to be a woman, is transandrophobia. Like, it's a transandrophobic specific experience that, like, other groups don't have for the same specific reasons. You know, like, corrective rape happens to several different groups, asexuals as well. This in particular, Brandon Teena, for example, was transandrophobia. It's not just misogyny, and it's not run-of-the-mill transphobia. It is targeted. It's an attempt to, like, strip you of your identity and teach you what you really are. It's bioessentialist in the extreme. That's not the only example. The more casual example, we talk about it actually a lot on this show because Anna Kasparian won't stop talking about, like, what we call people's body parts and people medically when it comes to reproductive health care. The reason why you know transandrophobia is different from misogyny is because Robert Eades would not have died of ovarian cancer if he were a woman, if he were a cisgender woman. He was denied medical care by roughly a dozen doctors because he was a transgender man. Each doctor, I'm sure, had their own reasoning. Maybe some of them thought, oh, you'll scare the women in my office. Maybe some of them thought, oh, if you're really a man, then you wouldn't be dying of ovarian cancer, so maybe this will teach you a lesson. Like, but he would not have died if he were a woman and had easy access to that care. Robert Eades died of metastatic ovarian cancer after being denied treatment for, like, over a year by about a dozen different doctors. So the idea that trans men, like, don't deserve this kind of care, or, like, being discriminated against on the specific basis of them being assigned female and transitioning into someone who's masculine, like, there are specific and targeted examples of that flavor of discrimination and bigotry. Super double plus hatred, true. Obviously, like many other bigotries, there are more mild forms of transandrophobia, things that can play out in small examples. If someone ever tells you, oh, you're too pretty to be trans, that's a specific kind of transandrophobia. People telling you that you sound weird, like people shit-talking your voice, because it's not uncommon for, like, trans men to sound like me, basically. Like, I could do voice training and not have this, like, disconnect, but I just don't want to. The T-slur voice, as it's called. People making fun of that is a very specific kind of targeting trans men, or, like, non-binary transmasculine people as well. Like, I'll just say, like, I'm non-binary, but I get looped into this. Like, I've experienced transandrophobia. More often what I get is non-binary phobic specifically, like transphobia against non-binary people in particular. Basically, microaggressions are still a form of bigotry. They just aren't things that result in injury or death, typically. Yeah, NB-phobic is usually what people say, even though a lot of non-binary people, I guess, don't like being called NB. But the term for it that we've started to use is NB-phobia. Honestly, like, I do think that it's important to recognize the ways in which specific groups are experiencing certain difficulties, because, like, frankly, in the whole conversation about don't call me a birthing woman, don't call me a menstruator, it's dehumanizing for you to call women birthing persons. Like, the thing that is always getting lost in the mix of those conversations is that this is a transandrophobic issue. People think, oh, we have this issue with, like, trans women trying to get into this women. Like, I genuinely think that folks who are not aware of trans men are assuming that the birthing person thing is somehow an attempt for trans women to get in on women's reproductive health care, which is just super weird. Like, I don't understand why they're so strange about it. I'm really tired of being passively called a woman in all of my PCOS care. It's sag. Yeah, like, you shouldn't have to tolerate being misgendered in order to access basic care. That's the thing that gets lost in that conversation. When people are asking, like, okay, so I know that trans misogyny affects trans women in the sense that sometimes trans women get murdered in a trans panic situation, allegedly trans panic situation. And like, so how are trans men being harmed? Like, okay, whatever, you're not being taken seriously as a man, whatever. Like, plenty of trans women are not being taken seriously as women, and they're being materially harmed, and they're by and large homeless and stuff. Like, trans men have a dramatically high rate of sexual assault over the course of their lifetime, and they're only beat out by non-binary assigned female individuals like myself. We have the highest rate of lifetime sexual assault of like any group based on gender. Like any group, if you're factoring in gender, and I don't know if there's probably racial disparities, like assigned female non-binary folks of color probably have like the highest incidence. But like, if we're just looking at gender, cis women have a lower rate than transgender women, and transgender men have a higher rate than transgender women, and non-binary people assigned female have a higher rate than literally any other group as of the last trans census. Which, does anybody know when the trans census is coming out again? I like filled it out and everything. Okay, official results coming in 2023. But yeah, it's not just a matter of people not enjoying being called a certain thing. If you deny people access, like they lose their lives. Transandrophobia is a particular danger in and of itself. It does result in deaths. It does result in traumatic sexual assaults and like all kinds of other jacked up stuff. This is not an attempt to elevate the issues of trans men and try to say, well, they're affected by this in a way that like other people aren't, and therefore our issues are more important. Like, I'm not trying to say that anyone's issues are more important, but rather that I think that the plight of trans men, and often like, non-binary people assigned female, it's just like an unseen, almost epidemic of hate crimes and sexual crimes against us. Like, people operate under the assumption that transgender men can just grow a beard and assimilate into society and everything's fine. But for the majority of people, like, we still struggle to access healthcare. We're denied hormones specifically because people are like, you're too pretty to be a trans man, or like, I don't think you're mature enough to decide, even though you're in your 20s. Like, we get denied transition-related healthcare for specifically transandrophobic reasons. Like, you can't assume that we have easy access in the world. Like, it is a travesty that trans men had such a difficult time talking about their experiences during the #MeToo movement, even more so than cisgender men. I think there's also something to be said about how we can often be at the intersection of the sexual violence of being perceived as a woman and then the toxic masculinity of not being man enough as we transition. Right, like the compounding issue of not only being a victim of sexual assault in a way that it's probably like you feel like you've been female victimized, and then also the toxic masculinity of being a man and being strong, and like how many trans men never come forward about their rape. Like, we don't know how many people are harmed by this and never call the police, like never get a rape kit done. And perhaps that being specifically because they're trying to be strong men, or maybe they're like stealth. Maybe they have to go to work the next day and they're totally stealth, and like they can't tell anyone at work that they were sexually assaulted or something because they're like, I don't want to risk being seen as less of a man. Like, I can't risk that. So just, listen to people when they talk about their issues. Shout out to trans men who are, being strong out there, dealing with being misgendered, dealing with being perceived as butch women instead of as your true gender. We appreciate you, and we wish you good luck this holiday season with navigating the difficulties of being queer this time of year, for sure. Thank you so much to my patrons and potential future patrons. I especially want to shout out Tiago Nascimento, Mersh Rolvog, Michelle Frateroli, Amanda B., Wellington Marcus, Michelle Winter, Danielle McDonald, Suzanne Maynard, Spooky Heather Sylvia, Past Null Infinity, Jamie Jam, Nova, Elizabeth Bartell, Sojo, Sarah A., Kevin Young, Athiet, Desi Quiche, Liam Hodgson, and Mr. Atheist.